två, ett. Hello and welcome to our presentation about xenophobia in America towards the Japanese American citizens.
To understand what the Japanese people face, we have to take a closer look in which country this was a problem in. Of course, USA. USA is a liberal democracy, which means that the power of the government is limited, also known as a Western democracy, which is the same type we have here in Sweden. Some important things with a liberal democracy is the same political right for everyone and freedom. That is protected by the Constitution. The Constitution has protected individuals since 1787. The Constitution is the supreme law of the USA, and it's a fundamental rules of how a country or state should be run. USA has a picture of itself as the greatest country on earth, based on military, high GDP, and inspirational music. American pop culture can be seen as the start of the modern pop culture we see today. American ideas spread all over the world in form of movies, clothes, and inspirational music. In 1939, World War II started. President of the United States during the time was Franklin D. Roosevelt, declared America as neutral. They did supply the Allies with much needed supplies such as materials for the war effort. Attack on Pearl Harbor, 7th December 1941, changed everything. The Japanese Empire Navy struck a surprise attack on the USA Navy Pacific Fleet, damaging aircraft and ships, and the loss of 2,400 American lives. This attack was a turning point in the war, making America go to war. Franklin D. Roosevelt declared public confirmed shot on sight on 11th September, effectively declaring war on Japanese allies, which was Germany and Italy during that time, in the Battle of the Atlantic. Battle of the Atlantic took part during the entire war, ending with Nazi Germany's fall.
So, what kind of problem was it? Japanese in the USA were discriminated and portrayed as weak, feeble, and as animals. Propaganda campaigns started targeting Japanese people during the 40s. Treatment of the Japanese Americans were categorized as dehumanizing. It was categorized as human rights violation, a form of racial discrimination, and a failure to the American legal system. Solely because of the ethnicity, people were being targeted and racially motivated to be dangerous to the country. People were being Japanese in the USA during this time had economic losses. They were being held to their freedom and property and such. This was a dark chapter in American history. Stigmas that lives up today during this time started during the 40s. This is a sobering reminder of the importance of the conflict system, the comforting system in justice. The dark chapter of history needs to be acknowledged. The mistreatments of Japanese Americans represents a failure of the democracy and the rule of law in the United States during this time. World War II represents a moral and an ethical dilemma challenging American self-image as a champion of freedom and democracy. It serves as a sobering reminder and safeguarding their rights and the dignity as an individual, regardless of the background or ethnicity. Yes. The roots of xenophobia is a phenomenon that has its beginning in the early days of the USA. When the Japanese people came to the States, even before World War II, there was a long history of anti-Asian Semitism in the United States, often fueled by economic competition and fear of the Yellow Peril. Japanese immigrants faced discrimination and exclusionary laws, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. Propaganda played a big part during this time when Americans were portraying the Japanese as bad people, making their lives horrible. Disloyalty to the Americans because they thought they were spies. Asian immigrants were seen as a threat to the economy. In a xenophobic perspective in America, were thought to fear the Japanese, which could lead them being exposed to racism. During World War II, propaganda played a significant role in shaping public opinion and perspectives of the Japanese people. The portrayal of Japanese individuals and cultures in propaganda materials, often dehumanizing and aimed at justifying the war effort against Japan. Xenophobia has been a problem in the States since the nation was founded. The racism and xenophobia had troubled American-born minorities for what feels like an eternity. The discrimination towards Japanese Americans during the early 40s is a prime example of the United States' crimes against its own people, which lives on today. America's stance started when the Japanese hate in America started when they bombed Pearl Harbor, which led to the American being suspicious against Japanese Americans hours after the attack, just being arrested Japanese people, an example, businessmen, journalists, and teachers. They were forced out of their jobs and abused and attacked in public places. The press responded with a wave of paranoid hysteria. The attack dehumanized Japanese Americans, them as spies, saboteurs and enemy agents. To summarize, the Americans were afraid of the Japanese because they thought there was a danger.
As you can see here is the statistics of how it looked. How many liked the Japanese and how many did not like the Japanese. And during this time period of the Pearl Harbor attack, the people who didn't like the Japanese increased, while the people who liked the Japanese decreased. And the Japanese were targeted because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were thought to be spies because of this attack. America imprisoned them without any amnesties and excluded them from the rest of the world. In that way, they were racist against the Japanese. As I earlier said, they were thought to be spies, but they were also portrayed as weak. In example, one Japanese man who lived during this time is Inoue. He was thought to be an enemy alien and could not use the US uniform because of that. And to fuel this, the American government used propaganda to create more divisions between them. As I said, they were portrayed as weak, and most of the Americans was learned to fear the Japanese, which led to much discrimination and step by step got worse. As I said, America's view changed throughout time during this time period. The xenophobia had got to them, and the ones they used to know was strangers. Us humans fear the unknown, and in this scenario was the Japanese the unknown. The ones they used to know is not known. And by doing that, they didn't hate them, they just feared them. And as I said, government was fueling it. And they did it by employment discrimination, so it was harder for Japanese people to get jobs. People didn't want to rent out because in that way they were renting out their houses and didn't want to risk their house for the Japanese. And they could encounter derogatory, which means negative commentaries, and they could encounter violence in public spaces or even in their own communities, and which led, but also they didn't have any health. It was harder for them to get health from the hospital, which led to their health decreasing.
What were the consequences of these things? So, to start, there was a loss of civil liberties. The Japanese Americans faced severe violations of their civil rights and liberties. They were forcibly removed from their homes and communities, often with little notice, and incarcerated in remote internment camps. It also had an economic impact. Many Japanese Americans lost their businesses, properties, and livelihoods due to internment. Their assets were often liquidated or lost during confinement, and they struggled to rebuild their lives after the war. It also led to stigma and discrimination. After the war, Japanese Americans continued to face prejudice and discrimination. Reintegration into society was challenging, and they often encountered barriers to employment, which means they didn't get that many jobs as they used to. They didn't even get They didn't even get houses. So they had a very tough period after the war, and their social acceptance was very low due to anti-Japanese sentiments. They also faced psychological trauma. Internment caused long-lasting psychological trauma for many Japanese Americans, especially those who were children at the time. The experience of being labeled as enemies and forcibly relocated left deep scars on individuals and families. The US government also faced significant criticism and legal challenges regarding the constitutionality of internment. In later years, there were efforts to acknowledge and address the injustice through official apologies, reparations, and the passage of legislation with Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provided compensation and apology to surviving internees. The internment experience contributed to broader discussion about civil rights and the treatment of minority groups in the US. It highlighted the dangers of racial profiling and discriminatory policies during times of national crisis. Here is actor Pat Morita explaining how he had it in the internment camp.
Must be some audio issues.
Yeah, seems to be some audio issues.
Might be the cord, possibly.
For the
Alright. So I guess it's not working.
so I guess
But we could summarize what he was speaking about in the
Yeah,
video. Just to
yeah, so I can summarize.
yes.
He was speaking about how he was moved, how he and his parents were migrated to the US from Japan, and his family was transferred to the Gila River camp in Arizona, and they were later transferred again to the Tule Lake camp in Northern California. After the war, Morita and his family were released from internment, and he went on to finish high school and become an actor.
Yes, okay, so let's talk about the compensations and reparations that the Japanese Americans received after the war. And honestly, there was only really one organization that was fighting for the justice of the Japanese Americans, and that was the Japanese American Citizens League, also known as the JACL. The JACL was formed in 1929 and was originally created to help the Asian community, and mostly the Japanese, with everyday things such as funding Japanese-owned businesses, and also teaching kids martial arts like judo and karate, also aikido. Yeah, so at first the JACL decided to fight for monetary compensation for the victims of the atrocities that America did to the Japanese. But after a while of fighting, they finally received monetary compensation, but they decided to instead pursue the investigation of the causes and consequences of the incarceration. So, okay, you can change slide. Yes, so here we see the JACL in its starting days, where the Japanese are parading in what's it called? Well, they're showing that they want decent housing, as you can see there. And here they are today, or this was a couple years ago. I assume this is a Japanese family. They usually hold festivals celebrating Japanese culture and such things like that. You can change slide. And here, as we know, America has a long history of discrimination and prejudice, as well as xenophobia. You see here, we see an African American man. It's supposed to, it says colored right here. So he was only allowed to drink through that colored water pipe. And you can see that monetary compensation for the atrocities that America has committed is often not sufficient for the people that were victims of it. The African Americans received 50 acres of land and a mule during the 1860s after being slaves. Obviously that wasn't really sufficient for being in slavery for the past 300 years or so. Here we also see the Native Americans. Obviously their land was taken from them under their feet, they were slaughtered, and they received homes in Indian reservations, as they're called. And to this day they still live there, and they face a lot of problems because it's basically a ghetto right now, where they have high-rising problems in gambling addiction and alcoholism. The compensation they received was little to none, honestly. And this is an evil cycle we see in America's history, where minorities get, they face tragedies from the American government, and they face little to none compensation or reparations.
So thank you for listening.
Yeah.